talk about some tools that are available to all of our churches and to organizations that allow those organizations to get off of their current life cycle and build a new future. And what we're trying to do here at Transformation Ministries is get as many churches as healthy as quick as possible. And most of us know the stats. 80% of churches are declining or heading down that way to death, and only 20% are healthy. So Transformation Ministries is about changing that exact opposite. We call it our 80-20 project. So I'm Mark Barguer. I'm going to be helping facilitate. Our agenda for what we're going to talk about today is really in 3 sections, so let me just kind of lay them out. First off, we're going to cover a little bit about life cycle. You just talked about, Matt. And we're going to talk about life cycle in a general way, but get very specific about churches. And it applies to businesses. This is a principle that's really kind of worldwide in a lot of different areas. In fact, all of us have a life cycle, right? In fact, I have people walk in my house, they see a picture of me, my wife and kids, and they're little, and my wife's beautiful, and they look at this guy with all this hair, and they go, "Who's that guy?" And I go, "Well, that was her first husband." So I'm on another life cycle. Didn't have a first husband, it was me. But we're all in decline physically, and our businesses can get that too. But our reminder today as we look at these life cycles is this. Jesus said the church is unstoppable. So it's supposed to last for perpetuity. From one interim pastor to the next interim pastors to the next person that's in the seat, we're all supposed to actually build on something that will last for perpetuity. But how do we do that strategically and set it up so that we're not leaving something that's dead, we're leaving something that can grow and continue to reach people for years to come? 2, Kirk's going to come up and lead some of our StratOps material. StratOps was developed by Tom Patterson. He's a business guy. I think he's had it out for about 40, 50 years. He's a consultant of what I call extreme strategist, probably the best known product in the business world for changing businesses to stay on track to their strategy. And that was adapted, because Tom Patterson's a Christian, so that he actually adapted it for churches. And then recently, the Unstuck group, when I say recently, the last 10 years, has taken his kind of domain and licensed process and made that available for churches in what we call an unstuck way, which means how do we really help our churches strategically? We have business and we have strategy for all the areas, but how do we do that specifically just for churches, knowing that that's where Unstuck's coming from, and that's specifically what we'll talk about today. Next part is what Matt came for, and that's lunch. We'll probably get to lunch about 12:30. By 1 o'clock, I'd like us to dive in for the last hour and tell you about the national agreement that I signed last Friday with the Unstuck group and what that means for all of us. What is available? How do you access it? What is the process? And I'm going to use a little bit of PowerPoints, their website. It's brand new for us to show. My first time to talk through it, but I've got some ideas for you to hear, and I'd love to hear your questions and see how that might work in our churches, in our businesses, in our camps, in our lives. There's life cycles throughout our life, right? Let me just tell you a few that we know of, right? Does a business have a life cycle?
Of course.
Yes, it does. I'm going to put this up here. What else do you know has a life cycle?
Personal relationships.
Relationships? Sure. Anyone else?
People.
People have a life cycle. Yeah, we talked about my hair and life itself. I'll be sharing a little bit more later about that for me, but people have a life cycle.
In abstract, but sports.
Sports? Sure. Yeah, we see that when Kobe Bryant's gone, the whole team is different.
Styles,
And
culture,
styles, yeah.
music has life cycles.
Culture. You see where this all goes? Can a dream or a vision have a life cycle?
Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Career.
A career, yeah.
Physical things like your car, house.
Car.
Mortgage payment.
Mortgage payment. Boy, we're getting specific now. So payments on, has a life cycle of when is it going to be over? What do we call that? Mortgage. Anything else?
One spiritual life.
One spiritual life. Excellent. Thank you. I love we have some spiritual people here. I was expecting that from pastors, but yeah, that's okay.
Well, you might as well put the church up there too.
The church has a life cycle. Great. What about products and services? Do they have a life cycle? Yeah. So the concept goes over a lot of different areas. Can we say that jobs and our vocations, and can I just make this very specific? Pastors have a life cycle? Is that okay if I put that there, pastors? Yeah. So lots of these things have life cycles. Let me tell you what we're going to talk about today. This one. However, I have people on my team who have written books on this, on this, on this, and on this. So we'll do a little bit of that today, but that's not mostly where we'll concentrate. But what we're going to apply today in our conversation applies in so many different ways. So life cycles really kind of move a lot of different places. We will work on a parabola that works something like that. How did I do?
Nice.
Oh yeah, nice. Thank you, Mike.
Steep.
A very steep parabola. Okay.
You turn it this way.
Yeah, it could be lots of things. So, but I want us to work together on what the life cycle is of all of these, but in particular the church. So today, Transformation Ministry is planning about 10 to 15 churches a year, brand new churches. One of the reasons why? Because new churches are easier. You don't have to go and change them. You actually can start them, maybe to reach the culture and the style and the people of today, in particular our millennial generation. It's harder sometimes in an older church. But what we call that is a launch cycle. Okay, if we can do that here. So there's a launch of a church or a business or whatever. The next thing we have is momentum growth. I'm going to write that this way, if that's okay. Because I can already see my is here, is where that happens. Momentum growth is like, have you ever been part of an organization or with people, and it's like, no matter what you do, the business is growing, the church is growing, it's like, anything you throw out, it doesn't matter, because it's just like, the momentum's just carrying it. Our next stage would be, I'm going to write this way, because I can see I should have used it a different way. Strategic growth is in here. Strategic growth allows an organization, or in particular a church, to really get strategic and start saying, hey, it's not as natural as it used to be. What do we need to do different? What do we need to change? And there's a lot of conversations that begin to start happening about, okay, when we launched, everybody was excited, and it just kept going, but we better get strategic to keep this thing happening, because otherwise it's going to come off the rails. This happens with products in the industry as well, right? And we'll maybe talk a little bit about that. If I can then cross this way, because what this is sustained health at the top. This is a healthy organization. It's the life cycle. For those of us that were younger, some of us remember this. When was this date? Like maybe between 18 and 35. We were at the top of our game, right? Nobody could touch us when we were playing basketball. Nobody could paddle faster than me into the wave. And then from there, it goes down, right? So I'm not telling you all about this stage. We're going to go in a little bit more. But let's look at what happens next in an organization. And I did this too steep, so I'm going to do it this way. The next thing that happens here is what's called preventative. Or preservation, let me get this right. Preservation. Have you been in an organization before that everybody just starts to pull in? You're not looking outward anymore. You're just trying to maintain what you had before. We just want to preserve. And when you go to churches that are like this, what they start saying is words like this. Don't go, stay. We just want to have what we used to have. A lot of what you hear in churches like this is, remember back in 1950 when we had 3,000 people, or whatever the year was? Oh, that's what we need to go back to. We just need to preserve our legacy. We've changed with the culture. We shouldn't have, so there's this conversation about going back to the way it used to be. The good old days. There were probably some songs we could sing in here. We're not going to do that today. All right. Next one, after preservation, is what's called maintenance. You guys know this stage? That stage is like a car. It's old. It's all about maintenance, and pretty soon it gets so costly, you just got to get rid of it. But maintenance is we just got to maintain. We're not making any new moves. We all huddle together, and we just want to be together. Don't change anything. Let's just maintain what we've got. You with me here? I'm not going deep here, but we'll do that in a little bit. Next one, and this really is down in this area. I'm going to get better at drawing this as I go. Okay. The last one here is what we call life support. You know any organizations on life support? Or any churches on life support? Yeah. It's the death rattle. And there are signs and characteristics of every single one of these steps. Now let me ask you, as we go forward today, we're going to do some honest thinking for a moment. Just with the general description that I've given you, where do you think your organization is today? And I want you to locate yourself on this: launched, momentum growth, strategic growth, sustained health, preservation, maintenance, life support. What has to happen before we're going to make any change forward is you got to accept the reality of where you are today. Why don't we put this on a time basis from here to here? And this I'm going to speak to for the church. Now we know products like Procter & Gamble is really good with their product life cycle. You guys know Tide, right? Anybody use that still? Yeah, it tastes terrible. But Procter & Gamble is just excellent at building a new growth curve every time their product hits low. What did it used to be? It's in a new and improved, right? You remember this? Oh, it's in a new box. It's the same product, But maybe they did add a granule to it or a different color and it looks better. And today it's pods, right? Those, you don't even have to get your hands dirty, worry about it going anywhere. It's in this little plastic pod. What they've done is constantly extend their growth cycle. And my point to you is there are ways to do that with all of our organizations and churches. Now, I'm not going to talk to product or service life cycles, but let's just talk about the church. It used to be the church life cycle was about 50 years. From here to there. And I'm bringing this up specifically because your question, Bob. What's a typical life cycle? So if a church didn't reinvent itself within 50 years, this was probably up to about 1960. Okay? Then it would die. And it'd go another direction. You know what the life cycle is now today? 5 to 8 years. So when we plant a new church, I meet with our church planters. I say, awesome, you just launched a church. You've got momentum growth. You're going to start doing some strategic things. We'll be talking. But if you don't start doing some things before you start falling off into preservation maintenance, within 5 to 8 years you will be gone. Much faster pace, much quicker than it used to be. And so you have to react faster. That's why a church can get planted down the street from you in Ladera Ranch. I'll just use because I know where you live. And it could be gone Now let's use business stats for a second. How many new church plants last longer than 5 years? Business stats are the same as church planting stats. 9 out of 10 businesses fail, brand new businesses, within the first 5 years. Church plants are exactly the same way, so that may be what you're referring to. But here's some good news. We have this church planting team that 9 out of 10 of our church plants are still alive after 5 years. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but our group that's doing discovery centers, putting people in place, filtering our people that are going there, the money we're investing in, the support team around them is so good that it's outlasting the stats, and we're really proud of that at Transformation Ministries. More than that, we think that's what glorifies God. That's how new churches start. Just a little bit on that. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of effort and time and leadership to bring it back. It's not that it's impossible, We know that with God, all things are possible. But we also know sometimes people, it's just time to let go and not spend all that effort, dollars, and time on it. I don't like to do that, if I'm just saying my personal preference. There are times when you just say, you know what, it's not serving a purpose anymore. In the business world, it's a natural eat or be eaten, or survive or not survive. You know, if you're not profitable and you get to this point, I mean, you're gone because you don't have any money to keep going. And this is where my heart beats, is how do we help people get back on a positive growth cycle of health, of vitality? We call this, in this area, revitalization, if you will. How do we help revitalize a church? And sometimes it involves a relaunch so that they can be in the area of life cycle that we all desire to be. So we have churches that they got a building, they got 5 people left. Well, what are we going to do with it? We could hand the keys to a church planter who has the mentality, I can reach the next generation, I see the possibilities, not the past that's going to hold me back, and plant a new church. So I probably should have written that up here too. Let me do that. To revitalize that church and make it new. And I love the verse in Corinthians that says, behold, all things have become new. The old is gone, the new has come. And I think God can do that. So we use that in our church health team to say, what does God want to do? One of the things I love about Tony's book is it's not a book of, oh, you're going to die. You know, I've read those books before and it's all negative. He says, do the process, assess yourself, know where you are, but here's 7 strategies that I've seen work that could bring you back. In every single, or even if you're in the launch, momentum growth, strategic growth, what are the steps that we could take that actually, first off, what are the characteristics of where we are? Oh yeah, that's where we are. And you'll see some of that on the paper I have there in front of you. But also, what are specific things we could do to help us get to where we believe God wants us to go? So, how about we take on preservation, maintenance, preservation. Does that sound good? Yeah. First off, the ministry is completely disconnected from the community. Mark, I think it was you that said, you know, they're totally done inside, they're not reaching outside anymore. 2, there's no unified mission, vision, or strategy. Been to a lot of churches where you say, hey, what's your mission, vision, strategy? I get a different answer from everybody in the church. 3, staff and volunteers are solely focused on their ministry areas and guarding their own turf. You ever see that in churches? And it's maintenance. Don't even try and take my budget because we've got to survive. The high school ministry is what this, or whatever, is about. And then everything in the entire church, fourthly, is pulling towards the past. It's all going that way. We got to go back to the past. That's where we had success. Why did we ever leave that? There's this whole conversation going on about the past. So many of the churches in this phase will continue down toward life support and eventually die. They're heading here. Unless they make some changes, and the key is change. So here's a couple ideas for change. I don't remember if I have these 6 for you, but I'm going to just recap them. Change will be required as you can't preserve the past and expect to go to a place of health. There must be an urgency to change. Urgency to change. Secondly, prayer is the foundation of every season of health, but maybe even more in this phase. If the church is not on its knees, there's not heart change happening, there's not spiritual awakening, it's not going to happen. This is essential. Thirdly, the church's heart must change. Have you been in hard-hearted churches before? Anybody walked into those? You can like feel it when you walk in the room. But now we know that only God can produce heart change. But that's what's going to be required in a church that's in this stage of preservation. Fourthly, transformation of people shifts from focus from playing church. It has to switch from that. We're not playing church anymore. We've got to reach people for Jesus. That's what we're supposed to be about. Making disciples. If we're not reaching new people for Jesus and the whole church isn't involved with it, that's why many of our churches have adopted from Tom Mercer High Desert Church the oikos model that we offer as a way to actually get your church out of its seat and onto the streets to tell your 8 to 15 strategic people that are in your life how to move forward. Fifthly, a growing core of people must realize that church isn't about me. You ever been to those churches? Like, it's about me. In fact, don't sit in my seat. Have you ever been to a church where you sat in the wrong seat and somebody basically came up and said, "That's my seat, get out of that seat," and you're a visitor? I have. It's some of the churches that we've gone to. Actually, I go as a secret shopper and I sit in the wrong seat on purpose. And the pastor's wife tells me to get out of her seat. And there's a whole mindset there. It's not about making people feel welcome. It's all about me. And preferences aren't as important as the people we are trying to reach. So that includes things like music, style, liturgy, the whole look of the service, the branding. How does it look to somebody that's brand new that walks off the street? Sixthly, actions required to carry out God's mission. Without action, our faith is meaningless. Faith demands action. And some of the tools you're going to see from starting with a little bit of what Kirk does is there'll be some ideas. You'll say, oh, I can see there's action points that works out of StratOps, the unstuck process, and some of the things that are there. So there's some things you can do to actually help churches. You'll notice on your page it should say characteristics of churches that are stuck in the preservation phase. Does it say that? Mm-hmm. There they are. Attendances and finances are both down. Methods are more important than mission. Ministry silos become entrenched. There's a prevailing pull to go back to the way it was. Strong leaders and visionaries have all left the church. We see this all the time as we walk in as a church health team, and we see it's all just about people that want to keep it the way it was or go back to the past. Power shifts from the pastor and staff to lay leadership. In a church recently that 23 years ago, they had a pastor who was so strong and such a, can I say this out loud, a bully, that they changed their entire constitution so that the pastor that followed him and was there for 23 years had 0 vote, 0 power, and 0 authority. So, yeah, it's amazing that when it's done right in a transition, and we think that's when most of the change can happen is during a transition. So then lastly, the focus shifts to keeping people from leaving as a defensive posture. Please don't leave. Instead of, please come to our church, don't leave. And so everything changes there. So Tony has this great graph in here that I'm going to use, but I'm going to write this with a permanent pen in the right place. This is called buy-in to change on this axis here, and this, how does that happen over time? I love the idea. The first phase you see there that he has, that I have on your piece of paper, is create urgency. How do we create urgency in a church? It's about honesty. You know, things really aren't right here. We're not okay. So if we want to build urgency, where because tradition is powerful, pain is the key to change. Now, pain sometimes is hard to do as a pastor. Some of us are prophetic. Some of us are more pastor lovers. Some of us, do it different ways, but people need to hear the truth, or they may not embrace it. So in every church we go to, we actually do this on a board with the people around the room going, where are we? People say, oh, we're great. But I have them do it separately before, and then I have them pass it up, and then I put them up there not telling people, because they need an honest assessment that we've got to create some urgency to move from here to there. Most of us have heard this in one way or another. Lots of good books. Andy Stanley book. I used to like a guy named Bill Hybels, not so much anymore. But he said, he had some great ideas on how to do that. And what has happened during this phase? Well, Tony thinks it's about conviction. You cannot cast a vision if you're not convicted yourself, and your organization has to be convicted. God is saddened by His house the way it is. He wants it to move in a different direction. And you need a vision that's clear and compelling to move people from where they are to where God wants to take them. Third phase is you implement change. I think I was telling Matt before we started here that my makeup is I'm a change maker. I'm a catalyst for change. I love change. Except, of course, when it's my stuff, you're going to change. Now, I'm just saying that honestly because that's how some of us think about change. It's okay, change other people's stuff, but not mine. But what does it take to change in a church? this is where leaders become leaders. At this point, change is only a conversation. I have a lot of pastors, for instance, talk about change is necessary, we've got to do it. But it never happens. Lots of reasons, but fear is one of the reasons that it rules the day. Pastors are afraid to address it. I was telling Matt a little earlier today, I was a transitional pastor in 7 different churches, and in 2 of them I got fired. Praise the Lord. You know why? I touched the Ark of the Covenant. You know, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you've seen that. You know what I touched? The sacred cow in the church that the last pastor wouldn't touch. I can tell you, I'll just say it out. One of the churches, well, I'm not going to say the name, but the pastor called me back and said, thank you for doing that while you're here. I know you got canned. I know who you are. Thank you, because I didn't have to deal with that. And what does it take? This is where courage becomes a big deal. People talk about courage, but stepping up and actually doing it is what needs to happen. See, there will be people in your church that will leave because of the decisions you make in this right here. You're going to cast a vision, you're going to create urgency, but when you implement the change, he says, we're not just talking anymore, we're doing it. And yes, you have to decide, if you're new, you may not have enough leadership chips and capital yet to actually lead that change. Sometimes it's smarter to wait. If you're a transitional pastor like me, I just like going in and blowing things up. Now, I can say that honestly because I know if I blow that up, that church is healthier after it's gone. So that's a hard decision for a senior pastor that's been there 24 years like you. The longer you're there, the easier it is to slip back to, well, maybe that the urgency, I don't need to create it because, I'm going to retire in a couple of years. The fear creeps in. And I get that. I've been in jobs before where I stepped out and did something and got slapped for it, and later I was gone. In a church, in the business world where I spent 25 years, and sometimes you're ahead of the curve. I always think of the Edsel. Remember that car? It was so far ahead of the curve when they brought it out as a product that nobody bought it. And it failed, not because it wasn't a great product, but because it was at the wrong time. So timing has something to do with it too. Relationships have something to do with it too. But I would encourage you through this conversation, be strong and courageous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Be strong and courageous. Prophetic people, that's easy. Pastor shepherd people, I know I'm pointing at you, okay? Nobody knows that I'm pointing at you. Pastor shepherd people have a harder time with that. Sometimes you need that other person that compliments you next to you to walk and take the courage and maybe even take the hit. And there are people that will do that, including your church health team, by the way. So I tell, when we come in to implement change inside of a church, I let them know, hey, Pastor, you shouldn't lead the change on this, Matt. Let us lead it. Let it be our idea. If we get shot down, we just go away. You need to stay here because you're God's man. That's another way to do it. But you need to make the change. Unless you have enough people around you to make the change, you really can't move forward. So you have to cast the vision enough so you get enough people to go with you that if everybody else leaves and we have the 12, we're left. The 12 disciples are here, we're good. Jesus changed the world with 12. You okay with your church going from 40 or 70 down to 12? Because it'll be painful, but it might be the exact change you need to do, and this is where you got to be on your knees, and that prayer is so important, to make this organization become what God intends your place to be for the future. That takes courage, gentlemen. I know that's what this is. It's no different in the business world, by the way. It's just you lose your house and your wife and your kids and your car and your Tesla and whatever. But the difference is we're doing it for another reason. It's not for profit. As Paul said, I do not, all that I thought was profit is now loss. I consider it my privilege to suffer for Jesus. And sometimes that's what this is. I'm not saying sacrifice yourself that way in every situation. Boy, that takes God's leadership to tell you when and what to step up into. There's a great book in this regard that you might want to check out. It's called For a New Generation. And that book gives a 2-year struggle of one pastor who said, I'm going to do this kind of step. And he gives actually how he did it and how many people left his church. And what we thought, oh my gosh, what did we do? And then how it all came back and started to achieve what God had given him directives to do. It's a great, we love to hear those stories, don't we? Because when we're making change, it doesn't feel so good when you're right in the middle of it. It's painful, it hurts, and it takes something else too. I just want to remind us, phase 4 is celebrate the wins. Oh, man, we're so bad at this in church, aren't we? I love it when churches do once a year, they roll out the red carpet and they celebrate all their volunteers. In fact, it's not just once a year, it should be every week. I know at camps that Mike runs, he does some great things to celebrate the people. This is not high pay. They're in a mountain. Sometimes they're sleeping in a bunk bed along with everybody else. There's lots of stuff going on. And you know what? They're committed to it because he celebrates wins along the way. I've seen you do that, Mike. And if we do that in the church, what does that take? Is resolve. You have to resolve to actually do what you said. We got to create urgency. This is our vision. It's going to upset some people. Some people might actually leave, but I have the courage to do it. But I'm going to resolve to do it. In fact, what you're going to see out of the StratOps and Unstuck thing that I love, and it's not on his chart, but let me just call it out for you. The thing that we're worst at in churches, we're great at writing these grandiose mission statements. Oh, they're cool, vision, core values. I've seen this in business too, and they hang on the wall. Everybody says that's cute and that's nice, but we never do them. The thing that StratOps bring to this is it brings you to this place where you do action plans and steps. And you hold somebody accountable to actually do it. And so that's one of the things I love about the Unstuck process that we'll talk more about as we go. So this is, what does this take? I call this intentional leadership. In any organization, it takes intentional leadership. And this is the process that you're leading through. There's a lot of warning signs and intentional leadership, and we got to look backwards before we can look forward. We prioritize the main thing, and then we lead strong, we address the warning signs, we rediscover why the church was healthy in the past, but then we restructure the governing board for the future, and we prioritize the church events that we really want to be involved with. One church I went to was at their heyday, there were 270 people. They weren't stopping doing things. They still thought they were a 250 people church. So they had just as many events, one secretary trying to do them, and some lonely transitional bald pastor driving in every day to try and get them all done. And here's what I said. Stop! We've got to change. Don't do any of that stuff anymore. Let's figure out only what we're good at. We're smaller, but God's got something for us to do right now. We figured that out together, and that church started growing again. But they were not going to stop doing any of that stuff because they'd always done it that way.